within Christianity, a lot of times you say, oh, it's just a local flood in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley in the Middle East. Well, actually, there's powerful evidence. If we open our eyes, we've got to use our flood glasses to look at it. And you know something? You see it all over the place. Now, I've been in the creation evolution issue for about 30 years, and I've focused on earth sciences. You know, you can divide up the origins issue into the evolutionary assumptions, assumption A, and the creation assumptions, assumption B, and we use the same facts generally. I mean, there's some exceptions to this, the rocks and the fossils. And you know, with those different assumptions, we get totally different interpretations. It's where your worldview is. It's where your mind is. It's where your heart is that counts. Now, my focus has been on to use the assumptions, the biblical assumptions and science, and using the data, and to answer or try to answer challenges that the evolutionists has given us. That's been my challenge. Like, what about the Ice Age? What about rocks, fossils? How do they get there? See, that's been my focus, not necessarily to bash evolution, which is really easy to do. It really is. I was amazed how easy it is to do. And, of course, Mike and Tom have done a good job at doing that. So I'm going to look at the rocks and fossils. And actually, I'm not going to look at too many of them, but it's which bias we're talking about. Which interpretation? Either the Bible is true or the Bible is not true. Using mostly the same evidence. I must put a caveat on that because I go out in the field all the time looking at the rocks, and a lot of times it's what they don't report in the scientific literature in geology that's very key. So we go out and we see things out there that they don't report that is very key to the interpretation. First of all, it's a global flood. Now, I start with the Bible first and science second. And so when I grew up in what many would consider a liberal church, I wouldn't necessarily use that term, and I was taught, you know, there's errors in the Bible and the whole shot, so I had to check it out for myself. And I found that in the Bible, the evidence for a global flood wins hands down. The context, destroy all mankind. And by the way, why did God do this? Was it because he was mean and nasty? No, he says that evil was in man's thoughts continually. Man was thinking of evil continually. It must have been a horrible situation, so he had no choice. The ark landed in the mountains. Now, I'm a meteorologist. Actually, I'm the best type of meteorologist there are. That's a weather guesser for short. The best type is a retired weather guesser, and that's what I am. And I'm no longer to blame for ruining hundreds and thousands of picnics and all that outdoor activity. But anyway, when water dumps and you have a flood, anybody in a boat and like that is going to go downstream or end up in the ocean if you go far enough. They're not going to end up in the mountains. Well, the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. That's what happened if the waters were global and they just descended, dropped like that. And the first place the boat is going to land is on the highest terrain that shows up, and that's going to be the mountains. Makes a lot of sense. And why have all those animals on the ark if it's just a local flood? I mean, they can flee to the Zagros Mountains, which are pretty close to the Middle East, which are up to 15,000 feet high. And a 371-day flood is hardly local. I've forecasted a number of floods, flash floods, river floods, and they're over with in usually a day or even sometimes an hour. 371-day flood is hardly local. So the Scripture indicates that it was a global flood. And the covenant of the rainbow would make no sense if it was a local flood, because there's been hundreds of thousands of local floods since. Like Genesis 7:9, as far as context, says, and the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Now, doesn't that sound like a universal global flood? And just think of this. Look at the upper left in there. Look at that beautiful rainbow. It's a promise from God that he'll never again flood the entire earth as he did in Noah's day. Well, my Christian college professor said that Noah's flood didn't cover the entire earth. He told you it was just a localized flood? That's what he said. Look at the bottom right. So he believes that God promised to never again send a localized flood? See, it doesn't make sense, does it, that it's a local flood? And of course, Jesus. Now that's where the buck should stop. Jesus says, for in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. Jesus believed that Noah was a real person, the ark was a real person. I mean, the ark was a real boat. Hey, I'm a morning person. And I fade in the evening, so if I trip over my words, forgive me, please. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. Just a few of them? In the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, in the local flood? No, all of them. Anyway, now if you're thinking of a flood, I'm using a man named Tasman Walker from Australia. He developed a terminology or a model of a flood just from Scripture. What would you expect from the flood? Well, it would rise and it would fall. I mean, that's what floods do, right? And of course, we don't know what the pre-flood geography was like. In fact, it was probably totally ripped up and destroyed. But in general, the relative sea level is like this, and the time in the flood is this way. By the way, the flood was 371 days, not 40 days. But if you had to draw the sequence of the flood, it would be a rise with sea level going up and down in a general rise. That's what that squiggly line means. It's not because I can't draw, which is actually a true statement, but it's because I deliberately did that. Because sea level, because of tectonics and other forces, would be going up and down like this in a general rise. Then it'll peak about 150 days. Now, there's some people that think that it peaked at 40 days. It's, a difference of opinion, and there's no way to resolve it. But at 150 days, it starts to flow off the earth, and the present continents become exposed. That's what we expect in a flood. Now, you can split that up into the flooding stage for the first 150 days and the retreating stage. Now, I'm only going to focus in on the retreating stage because that was the last stage of the flood as it came off the land. So we should see the evidence of the retreating waters off the land if the flood was a real event. This gets into the geological field of what's called geomorphology. Remember that big word that Mike gave you called morphology? Shape means shape. Geo means earth. It's the shape of the earth. And the shape of the earth, features of the earth's surface, should say flood. And the alternative explanation, uniformitarianism, which is the present is the key to the past, should have a lot of difficulty explaining these things. So that's what I'm going to focus in on. And you can divide that up into two phases. The water moving off the land as a sheet and then moving off in channels. Now why channels and the sheet? Because when the earth is totally flooded and you only have maybe one mountain up, Mount Ararat, the water's moving around the earth maybe in currents 1,000 miles wide. So it's moving sort of as a sheet. Not very deep, maybe it's 1,000 feet deep, but it's 1,000 miles wide. It's moving across the earth like that. And it produces certain features on the earth's surface. But then when you got mountains and plateaus sticking up, the water's forced to flow around these obstacles. And therefore it forms channel. It's the channelized phase. So there's two phases. Water moves as a sheet, then it's forced to become more channelized. And it's important to point this out because features on the earth's surface give evidence of both phases. So I'm going to talk especially about water moving as sheets. Most of my talk is going to be about the evidence of the water moving off the continents as sheets. It causes rapid erosion of the continents. See, the continents are rising, the water's moving off. It's going to erode those continents. And then where's the material going to go? It's going to end up along the edge of the continents in deeper water. And what is it going to do? It's going to plane land, forming what's called planation surfaces. And I'm going to go through all this. This is a summary of my talk right here. But this is, I'm going to also talk about this. As it's moving in channels, it's going to cut what is called water and wind gaps. A typical water gap around here is the Columbia Gorge. It's a cut in the mountains that's perpendicular to it. That's a water gap, to where water is flowing through it. I don't think I'm going to get into wind gaps. That's a gap higher in the mountains where you have a V notch out and only wind is going through that. I don't think I'll have time, but I have pictures for all these. Also, it forms what's called pediments. A pediment means near, and ment means mountain. So it's a flat planation surface at the foot of a mountain. And it excavates submarine canyons, all very rapidly. Submarine canyons are canyons that you go out on the continental shelf, and perpendicular to the continent, you have this deep gash that goes about an average of 3,000 feet deep and 50 miles long is the average submarine canyon. Now, there are hundreds of submarine canyons along the continents. And some of these canyons are deeper than Grand Canyon. And one of them is even longer than Grand Canyon. It's the Bering Canyon. Now, if you did a present-day erosion of the surface for 5,000 years in various reliefs, mountains to smooth plains and high precipitation, this is the rate currently. 7 feet in 5,000 years, and the lowest is down in here, less than a foot. This, of course, there have been ice ages, which I'll talk about tomorrow about ice ages. If you think this air conditioning is cold in here, wait till I talk to you about the ice age tomorrow. Hope to freeze you out. But anyway, the point of this is that the flood was about 5,000 years ago. So this is not a lot of erosion. So what the flood produced should still be there. It didn't have time to erode in 5,000 years because we've had very little erosion in 5,000 years. That's the point of that. So the first question to ask when you have a totally globally flooded earth, how did the waters drain? Where did they go? Well, I think Psalm 104, 6-9 has the answer. It's really interesting how in some cases it's right there, right in the Bible. Psalm 104 says, "The waters were standing above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. The mountains rose, the valley sank down." That's the key verse right there. The mountains rose, the valley sank down to the place which thou didst establish for them. Thou didst set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. There are 2 times in the history of the earth that the earth was totally flooded. On the 3rd day of creation, when it was created with covering of water, and in the global flood. This obviously is talking about the global flood because this is the last time that the earth was totally flooded. But at thy rebuke the waters fled, and at that time the mountains rose, the valleys sank down. That's how they drain. In other words, mountains rise, valleys sink down, and then at the same time continents rise and ocean basins sink. So the waters flow off the continents into the ocean basins. Like this. This is the Continental Divide here in western Montana. And it's uplifting. It's probably the first area to get up, to come out of the floodwaters. And the water is flowing strongly towards the Pacific Ocean on the west side and strongly towards the Mississippi River Valley on the east. That's the picture I want to present. Now, it's interesting that you can go to many mountainous areas or many places of the earth, in fact, practically all places of the earth, and it's a theme that you have sections of the crust that have gone up and sections that have gone down. Now, where I live, in southwest Montana, I'm close to what's called the Beartooth Mountains right here. Now, they're about 10,000 to 13,000 feet tall, and that's granite. That pattern is granite. But you go to the adjacent Bighorn Basin, and it's filled with sediments. But granite, where you reach granite in there, is at 10,000 feet below sea level. So at this point right in here, what's called the Beartooth Fault, you had a differential change where the mountains went up and this valley or basin went down, and a 23,000-foot difference right here at the Beartooth Mountains. Over on the other side of the Bighorn Mountains, you have another situation with the Bighorn Mountains and the Powder River Basin. In fact, most little mountain ranges east of the Continental Divide are like this, that where you have mountains rise and valleys sink down. This is a theme, a global theme, just like Psalm 104 says. And I think it was also a theme on a larger scale, where the continents were coming up out of the floodwaters and the ocean basins sinking. Like this. After the flood, you had the continents with its mountain ranges and basins right in there, and they had the ocean basins sink. Now, is there any evidence for such a thing? Well, in a recent book by Olier and Payne, The Origin of Mountains, they said that most mountains look fresh, as if they're recently formed. In this book, it shows that mountains are not made directly by folding, but the result of vertical uplift of plains. In other words, mountains are formed from vertical uplift of plains. They think they were plain first, and then they came up, and then they eroded to form, which may later be eroded into rugged mountains. It also assembles the evidence that this uplift occurred in the last few million years. Now, I'm quoting evolutionists, and when they say the last few million years, that is the very end of their time scale, meaning they're recent. You know, and to them, they automatically say, oh, a few million years, and not 100 million, not a billion, indicating the mountains are recent because they're very fresh-looking, except the Appalachians and a few mountains like that, of course. Also, is there evidence that the ocean basins have sunk? Yes, there is, in the form of guyotts. On the bottom of the ocean, we have at least 50,000 what's called seamounts. They're mostly submarine volcanoes. But there's well over 1,000 of these called guyotts that are truncated flat. In order to do that, it has to be at sea level and probably pretty fast currents, probably during the flood. I'm not sure sea level today can do that. But the interesting thing about these flat guyotts that were at sea level is that they're an average of 5,000 feet below sea level now, indicating that the bottom of the ocean is sunk an average of 5,000 feet. Now I'm going to quote my favorite geomorphologist, Lester King. He's an evolutionist, and I'd say for an evolutionist, he's a pretty independent thinker. And here's what he says about guyotts. Marine volcanic islands, which have been truncated by the waves and since subsided below sea level, are called guyotts. Most of them seem to have sunk by 600 to 2,000 meters. That's the translation into feet, multiplied approximately by 3. And it is evident that they afford a measure of the amount by which the ocean floor has sunk in later geological time. Notice that, later geological time. It's one of the last events in their geological time, is the ocean basin sinking. Now, well, that's exactly what we expect to drain the floodwaters, the ocean basin sinking. The Pacific floor especially has subsided. All the ocean basins afford evidence of subsidence amounting to hundreds and even thousands of meters in areas far from land. So the fundamental tectonic, now tectonics is a vertical motions of the earth crust. The fundamental, notice that, fundamental tectonic mechanism of global geology are vertical. That's up or down. And the normal and most general tectonic structures in the crust are also vertically disposed. But one must bear in mind that every part of the globe, on the continents and in the ocean basins, this is a theme in the bottom of the oceans too, by the way, called abyssal hills and abyssal plains. The plains are flat because they've been filled with sediments, but they're valleys. They're valleys. So you have this mountains and valley going up, and valleys sinking, even on the ocean bottom. It provides direct geological evidence. Notice that, direct geological evidence, not speculation, direct geological evidence that formerly it stood at different levels, up or down, and that it has been subject to in situ to vertical displacements. Excuse me about this mix-up here. My computer, I'm not using my computer, and I don't know why it's combining those, but anyway, it's doing it. So what he's saying is, to translate that, is that what we see now was at different levels, either up or down, and that all over the earth, in later geological periods, we have evidence of the crust going up or down. What powerful evidence is Psalm 104 that speaks of the drainage of the floodwater. There's powerful evidence. So, as the continents were rising up and the water was coming off, you'd expect a lot of erosion as a sheet, when it's moving as a sheet flow. Is there evidence of rapid sheet erosion? Actually, if you travel around the western U.S., you see a fair amount of it. Most of these slides I'm going to show are from Montana and Wyoming, and some in Canada, generally close to the Continental Divide. But you have these what's called erosional remnants. Devil's Tower. How many have been to Devil's Tower in northeast Wyoming? Isn't it rather odd to have that throat going up 800 feet high from this point right here and 1,200 feet above the river, just real thin? And then you see a road sign next to it that says that, well, this is the throat of a volcano, and these sedimentary rocks around here had to be at least over this volcano here. And they eroded down slowly over millions of years, 70 million years or so. And yet, that thin Devil's Tower hardly got touched in 70 million years. Now, Philip Johnson, he's the, you might say, the head of the intelligent design movement, says we need to put on our baloney detectors when they make statements like this. Now, we know that erosion is slow, but over millions of years it's fast. In fact, at the present rate of erosion, all of North America would erode to sea level in just 10 million years at the present rate. But as the mountains wear down, the rate will increase. So it's not that simple, but it's over 10, maybe up to 50 million years, North America is down to sea level. And yet, in that amount of time, actually more than that time, Devil's Tower just sits there, hardly eroding. And look at those joints. That's like a basalt. And, you know, how many have heard of freeze-thaw weathering, where you get water in a crack, and the freezing, I mean, this is right in my field of meteorology, because it splits it apart. That would be a pile of rubble probably in, I'd say, 50,000 years. It should be a pile of rubble. But yet they say it's been like that for 50 to 70 million years without hardly being touched, while all the plains around it eroded down to nearly a flat surface. Doesn't make sense. But there's more erosional remnants around. How many have been to Monument Valley? I mean, it's sandstone and shale. That sandstone is not very hard. You can go up there and just rub it off, flake it off. It's very soft. Why would all this area erode to a flat surface and leave these 1,000-foot remnants here? You know, it doesn't make sense by the properties of erosion that they should be there. The way you can explain all these is if a sheet, you see this in the channeled scablands with the Lake Missoula flood, if a sheet of water came and eroded most of it, but it leaves some of the more resistant remnants, or maybe because the currents were a little slower in that one spot, it leaves some erosional remnants in a flood. That's what you'd expect in a giant flood as a sheet flow, leaving a few erosional remnants. There's another throat of a volcano, Shiprock, northwest New Mexico, 1,700 feet. And all this area around it eroded away. See, the plains right in here had to be above this, and it all had to erode down to what you see, leaving 1,700-foot throat of a volcano hardly touched in millions of years. Put on your baloney detectors when you drive around, and you see a lot of geological features that don't make sense, but it's powerful evidence of the sheet erosion off the continent during the Genesis flood. Another thing, that quartzite rocks. Now, this is a research project I've been involved in for about 12 years. Quartzite is a metamorphic sandstone, and that's sand that's turned to stone, and then a little heat is added to the sandstone, and it kind of becomes a little glassy because, you know, sand is mostly silicon dioxide, like the windows up there. And when it does that, it becomes very hard, and it's resistant to erosion. And the Rocky Mountains are loaded with quartzite rocks, but there's hardly any of them on either side of the Rocky Mountains. Like there's hardly any in Washington and Oregon. In fact, I think only in extreme northeast Washington do you find quartzites. But I find these quartzite rocks spread hundreds of miles into North Dakota, Montana, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Wyoming, and on the other side I find them in Washington and Oregon. In fact, I have found them in the Puget Sound area where the glaciers have mixed them up. Well-rounded quartzite rocks, rounded by water. And the thing about it is that you can calculate, well, how fast of a current do we need to spread these quartzites from the point of the Rocky Mountains far, hundreds of miles from the nearest source? Well, we did those calculations. But first of all, let me show you some exotic places for quartzite. We find them on tops of mountains, by the way. Mountains that don't outcrop any quartzite, but we have the rounded quartzite rocks on these. Like here's the Wallowa Mountains in northeast Oregon. See these rounded rocks by water? This is on a ridge at near Lookout Mountain, 8,200 feet in the Wallowa Mountains. In fact, there's one of the quartzites, well-rounded by water action. That rock weighs 400 pounds. Now, what kind of currents are going to transport that? The nearest source is 60 miles to the east in Idaho, across Hell's Canyon, I might add. So how are you going to get these rounded rocks? And by the way, in these finer sediments in here, there's gold, because the the current was so fast the gold wouldn't settle out. It got mixed. So we're talking about powerful currents. And then the mountains came up and carried the quartzites to the tops of mountains. There's 4 mountains areas that we find that these rocks like this. The Wallowa Mountains. There's the mountains in Central Oregon. We found them last year in the top of the Blue Mountains. I found them in the top of a mountain range in southwest Montana called the Gravelly Range. And this summer, I'm going to hike up into the northern Tetons. And there's one of the Tetons that's been sheared off, planed. And we find rounded rocks on the top of that. I'm going to find, that's one of, I found them on 3. I'm going to check the 4th one. But anyway, the tracing of these things, and I'm going to get into this a little later, indicates powerful evidence for the flood. But first of all, I got to switch themes. As the water's moving as a sheet over the continents and eroding the continents, where's all the debris going? I mean, you erode something and you transport it, it's got to be deposited somewhere. Where it's going to be deposited where the currents slow down. This we observe in normal floods today. Well, where's that? Well, it's where the water becomes deeper, is where the currents will be forced to slow down, and that's at the edge of the continents. And that's the continental shelves. It's like a bathtub ring about 200 feet deep on the average all around the continents. Every continent, even small, I should say medium-sized islands, have a continental shelf. Now, the continental shelf is a strange profile when you consider normal processes over millions of years, because it's very shallow, goes out for miles and miles, and suddenly you have a big drop-off like this called the continental slope, and it continues to the continental rise and to the abyssal plains, which is the very deep ocean. And some of these are hundreds of miles long. Now, this nature should have more of a profile that's gradually starts from the beach and gradually goes down like that. That's what nature should produce today. But it doesn't, or it hadn't in the past. It formed the continental shelf. I think about the only way you can form this is if you have powerful sheets of sediment-laden water that flow off the continent like a huge river delta, and the river delta forms all around the continent because it's a sheet flow off the continents during the recessional stage of the flood. Now, I'm going back to Lester King, who says that these are strange features, these continental shelves, which are, like I said, a bathtub ring on all the continents. There arises, however, the question as to what marine agency was responsible for the leveling of the shelf, that's the continental shelf, in early Cenozoic time. A leveling that was preserved with minor modification until the offshore canyon cutting of the Quaternary time. Now, what he's saying there is that the shelf was formed in early Cenozoic time, which is kind of late in their time scale. But then the submarine canyons that cut perpendicular to the shelf didn't form until the very last period of time. But this is the key phrase right here. Briefly, the continental shelf is too wide, and towards the outer slope it's too deep to have been controlled by normal wind-generated waves of the ocean's surface. In other words, the winds produce the average currents of the ocean, and those ocean currents should form a gentle profile down to the deep ocean, not one that goes like this and like that. That's what he's saying. It's unnatural today. Well, I'd say it's pretty good evidence for the deposition of all the material the flood eroded off the continent and deposited along the edge of the continent. I'm going to skip that. In summary of sheet erosion and deposition of the continents, continental erosional remnants are evidence for rapid sheet erosion. The continental shelves provide evidence for rapid sheet deposition along the edges of the continents, not slow processes over millions of years. Now, I put that one in quote because that's the alternative explanation. It's called uniformitarianism, which is a dogma of geology. You can only explain the rocks by present processes over millions of years. That's it. That's all you allow. They don't allow catastrophes. Well, except for a few, like the meteorite that supposedly killed all the dinosaurs. That's a whole different story. Actually, the crater is now too small. They're finding out the real crater that they think in the Yucatan Peninsula is too small to have killed off all those dinosaurs. So now they got more problems. So that's a whole other topic. I got to talk on the dinosaurs like most creationist speakers. So I talked about water moving as sheets. It causes rapid erosion of the continents, and the deposition forms the continental shelves. Now I'm going to talk about the third part of this. It's called planation surfaces. What in the world is a planation surface? Well, think of plane. That can give you a hint. Plane. Well, here's what the Dictionary of Geological Terms says. It's a land surface shaped and subdued by the action of erosion. Well, okay. Especially by running water. Well, why running water? Well, it's kind of interesting. You have those rounded rocks on top of these plane surfaces. Rounded rocks are rounded primarily, in fact, totally by erosion. There are a few ways you can weather rounded rocks, but not when you see millions of them on here. They're not by weathering. They're by running water. The term is generally applied to a level or nearly level surface. If it's really flat, you call it a planation surface. If it's kind of rolling surface like this, you'd be called an erosion surface. That's the difference. I'm going to say planation surface because many of these surfaces are very flat looking. I'm going to show you. Here's an example of a planation surface, a small one. This is a little erosional remnant in the Bighorn Basin near Graybull, Wyoming. The sediments were probably a couple thousand feet deep at one time in the Bighorn Basin and eroded down to that level during the sheet flow erosion. And so this little remnant here was left. Here's the sedimentary rocks, which are those layer cake rocks you see when you drive around, especially in the Rocky Mountains. But you can see the sediments are dipping to the east about 25 degrees, and they're a combination of hard sandstones and soft shales dipping in that direction. But notice, whatever made this flat surface sheared off the hard and soft rocks the same. It didn't matter whether it was soft rock or hard, it was the same. Now, erosion today erodes soft rocks faster than hard rocks. So hard rocks end up at ridges, and soft rocks are valleys or dips. But whatever did this just sheared it off. And I haven't been up there, but I'd be willing to bet that has rounded rocks on it, indicating that water was responsible for that. Now, the interesting thing is, what we observe today is that water does not form planation surfaces today. We don't observe them forming, except maybe in a local area along a river, if the river shifts in a flood and erodes a little ridge, forming a little tiny planation surface. That's all we observe today. We don't observe nature today forming planation surfaces. We observe it being destroyed. I'm going to get into this a little more. But I must first of all talk about, well, if you haven't got the hint yet, what I'm getting at is the flood is the only mechanism as it's moving out the continent to form planation surfaces. But when it's doing that, there was a lot of activity during the flood. You had mountains going up and valleys sinking. You had a lot of volcanism. So these planation surfaces were modified also. After they were formed, they got modified. They'd be modified by uplift and sinking so that you have it broken up and a piece go up like that and forms the top of a mountain. I'm going to show you some mountaintop planation surfaces soon. Also, further erosion by flood currents will whittle the size. All these planation surfaces I'm going to show you are probably 10,000 square miles in size at one time, but yet the currents of the flood kept dissecting them to the point where now they're just smaller remnants. Now, some of these planation surfaces are still huge, maybe 1,000 square miles, but they were probably a lot larger at one time. Also, a lot of volcanism has occurred and piled on top of these planation surfaces and disguised them. So those are the modifications. So despite this, you could still see them as you drive around in the western U.S. Now, in the territory where I live in Montana, Peter Kleberg and I have been studying some special planation surfaces for about 10 years. In Montana and adjacent Saskatchewan and Alberta, there's generally 4 levels of planation surfaces, and the difference is about 2,000 feet. So we studied the highest planation surfaces. They form plateaus now. And these highest ones are right here. They're called the Cypress Hills and the Flaxville Plateaus, right in here. This is northeast Montana. These are plateaus in black. Look at the scale. That's in kilometers. That's 100 kilometers. That's equivalent to 60 miles. So this is a huge scale. These planation surfaces are really big. And here's a few just east of Glacier Park. Here's the Continental Divide right here. Now, the Cypress Hills I'm going to focus in on that. It's approximately 80 miles east-west, and about 10 miles north-south. So it's 800 square miles. And it used to be solidly connected, but has been dissected by glacial fluvial rivers during the Ice Age. See, after the flood, there was an Ice Age. If you want to know more about that, I'll tell you all about it tomorrow, or I'll just tell you a little bit about it. I can't tell you all about it. But anyway, this was once a solid surface right here. And the interesting thing about the Cypress, here's some pictures of the Cypress Hills. Notice how flat that is. Well, I call it the Cypress Hills. It should be called the Cypress Planation Surface. Here's another one. Now, no one's going to get excited about going out to the... Now, this is a resort areas in here. If you ever want to visit, it's some nice areas. No one's going to visit the Cypress Planation Surface. They'll visit the Cypress Hills. But this is an example of a dissection by glacial fluvial rivers. But notice how flat that is up there. Here's the eastern end of the Cypress Hills right here. It's flat, and it covered an area of about 800 square miles at one time. And when you drive up to it, that's what it looks like. It's about as flat as the plains of Kansas. I can't think of any place any flatter than the plains of Kansas. Hoping no one's from Kansas. But I love mountains. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and when I drove through Kansas, I couldn't believe how flat it was. But this is just as flat. And then when you go to the edge of it, you're looking down 1,000 feet into the next planation surface, north into Alberta. Here's the flat planation surface, but look at what it's capped with. About 75 feet are rounded quartzite rocks that don't outcrop anywhere in the plains. They were eroded from the Rocky Mountains and brought out hundreds of miles from the Rocky Mountains and ended up on the top of the Cypress Hills, 2,500 feet above the rivers that go around it. And they're sticking up 75 feet of these things, 10 miles wide and about 80 miles long. Rounded quartzite rocks by water action. That's a huge amount of erosion of the Rockies. So you can see how rounded they are. And I might add something. A lot of them are iron stained. A lot of these quartzite rocks are iron stained. And you know, wherever I go, whether it's the top of the Wallowa Mountains, Puget Sound, we find a lot of them in the Portland, Vancouver area. You find them a lot of eastern Washington and even in central Oregon. They're iron stained. A lot of them are iron stained. So same in Saskatchewan, as if it was the same environment that caused the erosion. Also, you find another property of these quartzite rocks. They have what's called percussion marks on them. These are very hard rocks, but yet they have these semicircular cracks on them. Here's some more of them. This is more typical right here. You find hundreds of these things, indicating that whatever eroded them was just turbulent, bouncing, hitting each other with a lot of force to put these on there. Now, that's significant because we can figure out how fast the currents were going by these percussion marks. Now, here's what occurred. It was water that eroded from the Rocky Mountains, the quartzites. And in the process, it was so turbulent that the large rocks were sliding along the bottom. And the medium, the smaller rocks were taken up into the current in turbulent flow and then come crashing down, banging against each other, forming those percussion marks. So what does that mean? Well, we can figure out the current speed because of the fall velocity versus the horizontal velocity. There's a relationship. And here's what we got. And I'm going to focus in on what's called a 6-inch bullet-shaped rock, 6 inches in diameter and bullet-shaped. We got from open channel flow equations in civil engineering, and these are minimums. We got minimum current depth of 180 feet and a minimum speed of 65 miles an hour. Well, the fastest flash floods on Earth go about 15 to 25 miles an hour, usually down steep slopes. Now, what are we talking about? We are talking about powerful evidence for the receding of the floodwaters off the continents and spreading the quartzite rocks hundreds of miles from their source. And then continuing to erode, leaving the Cypress Hills an erosional remnant 2,500 feet above the rivers that go around it. We're talking about powerful spreading of rocks and then powerful erosion afterwards. We summed it up in a publication, the International Conference on Creationism in Pittsburgh in 1998. Large rocks were transported 300 to 1,000 kilometers. Yes, 600 miles is about the furthest, I would say, they were transported over a low slope. not a steep slope, a low slope. Based on paleohydrological analysis, the rocks were transported in currents significantly faster and with greater discharges than modern flash floods. We conclude that a watery catastrophic process of regional extent very likely accounts for the gravel-capped planation surfaces. And here's kind of a way I envision it. This is a simplistic cartoon. During the flood, you had all this uplift occurring, whether it's granites or sedimentary rocks draped over the granites. And the flood waters were receding, and it sheared these things flat. And when it was ended, it ended up with a capping of rocks on the top. That's the big picture. Simple picture in cartoon style. That you see around where I live. Now, the interesting thing, you don't see them just in the Cypress Hills and other places. These are global. These features are global. Even on Antarctica, if you've ever seen any of the mountains sticking up out of the ice, some of them are flat topped, sheared off. And I'll show you some pictures. These are the Beartooth Mountains in Montana. These are the highest mountains in Montana, 13,500 feet. They don't quite get up to Mount Rainier standard, but they're still very impressive. But look at that. That's the very top of the Beartooth. Look at how flat those surfaces are. That's granite. There's nothing in nature that is going to shear off granite flat. It's like giant Paul Bunyan with a huge chainsaw went to the Teton Mountains and zipped off the Teton Mountains to flat. That's what it's how you can visualize it. There's a close-up of it. And by the way, they're at different altitudes because of tectonics. You know, where some parts went up higher and others sank down. There's a fault right in there. That's granite. Granite sheared flat. Now, nature doesn't do that, but the flood can do it. Now, another mountain range is close. This is the Northwest Wind River Mountains. There's a number of flat-top granite mountains in this vicinity. This one happens to be Square-Top Mountain. Also in the Wind River Mountains, in the northern, there's sedimentary rocks that are flat. And this is a limestone mountain called Gypsum Mountain. It's about 11,500 feet. It's the beds tilt to the west about 35, 40 degrees, and look at that, sheared off. But note that, it's rather pointed, so it's not quite as complicated. You have the Teton Mountains, which are very sharp looking, indicating no planation, but you go to the northern Tetons, Red Mountain and Mount Moran, they're sheared off flat. In fact, Red Mountain has rounded quartzites still left on it. The nearest source is central Idaho. I'm going to check that out this summer. Anyway, to sum it up, I'm going to go to Lester King again. And it's a little hard to understand this. I'm going to translate this as I go. Now, Lester King has studied the whole Earth as a geomorphologist from South Africa. And he says these planation surfaces are worldwide. And he generally says there's about 3 of them. In any one place, there's generally about 3 of them. And there's some debate over that. But in general, I'd say he's pretty close. He says a planation of extraordinary smoothness developed over enormous areas in all the continents. It's a global flood, not a local flood. These planation surfaces are on all continents. And I got files on each continent on these planation surfaces that I'll be publishing more on planation surfaces and other geomorphological aspects in the future. But anyway, I'm going to skip down. With emphasis upon its extreme planation, they are really flat. It appears particularly flat when viewed in cross-section as across the intervening valleys of successive cycles which commonly intersect it. From it, that is, all these planation surfaces, most of the world's present scenery has subsequently been developed. Now, on my computer, I wouldn't have a problem reading this. It must be that this is PowerPoint 203 and I got 202. But anyway, excuse me for the mix-up there. But anyway, he is saying that you have these flat planation surfaces all over the Earth. Powerful evidence for a global flood. So what should we expect from uniformitarian erosion, slow processes over millions of years? Well, the resistant sedimentary rocks, the hard layers, will get eroded less and they will stand up as ridges. The softer rocks, that's what you will erode, and the unconsolidated eroded debris will collect in the valley or be taken from rivers downstream and end up in the ocean. That's what you should predominantly see. And we do see a lot of that. I mean, we can explain that in the flood also, but that is what we commonly find all over the Earth. the hard and soft rocks are sheared off the same, and sometimes at very low angles, like that. That takes a powerful current to do that for hard and soft rocks, leaving rounded boulders indicating it was water that did it. Powerful evidence that the Genesis flood really happened in the past. And there's a planation surface in the Little Rocky Mountains, north central Montana. What we observe today is planation surfaces being dissected, being destroyed. That's what we observe, not being formed. They formed in the past by some processes we don't see today. Powerful evidence of Noah's flood. Now, the evolutionists, the evolutionary geologists are well aware of these. They've been trying to explain them for well over 100 years. And C.H. Crickmay, I think, was the closest of any evolutionary geomorphologist to getting it right. But, because he was an evolutionist, that messed his thinking up. But he wrote in a book that's called The Work of the River. If you ever get a chance to read it, read it. But notice that Work of the River, scenery of the earth, river. See, water has shaped the scenery of the earth. He says the difficulty that now confronts the students, and by the way, he's not talking about college students. He's talking about anybody that studies the earth. Students, professors, lay people alike, anyone that studies the earth. He says this is the difficulty, that though there are plenty of hypotheses, they got lots of ideas on geomorphic evolution, there is not one that would not be rejected by any majority vote for all competent minds. In other words, there's not one that a majority vote would vote for. And he says, that shouldn't be. We should easily be able to explain the surface of the earth. No, he says, this situation is remarkable in a respectable department of science in the later half of the 20th century. It's remarkable. And you know why? He's got the wrong basis. Using the Genesis flood, putting on the flood glasses, and you drive around, you should see these things. Your children, I think, can understand the significance of these planation surfaces, that they can only be planed by huge current, huge flood moving rapidly over, planing the surface to a flat planation surface. In summary, planation surfaces are common as erosional remnants. They're worldwide. They're difficult to explain by slow processes over millions of years. Now, I could say impossible, but I don't like to use that term, but I used difficult as the next best. Now I'm going to, at this time, I've usually run out of time, so I'm going to quickly broad brush water moving into channels. Now, I'm not going to talk about valleys because the evolutionists can explain valleys by millions of years of erosion. We can explain it as rapid channelized erosion to form valleys rapidly. I'm going to talk about some more exotic features of the Earth's surface that they can explain. Water and wind gaps, pediments, and submarine canyons. And I'm going to race through this. I'm just going to give you the conclusion. Now, you find these water gaps. Now, this is the Shoshone water gap near Cody, Wyoming, where this is the Rattlesnake Hills. And the Shoshone River cut a perpendicular gap through there. At least they think it did. 2,500 feet through hard granite and sedimentary rocks, when it could have easily gone around to the south. The river could have gone around to the south. Here's the Shoshone water gap, and here's the south. See, this is Buffalo Bill Reservoir. It's about a 100-foot dam. And look at how low it is there. When the valley was filled more with sedimentary rocks, it could have easily gone to the south around it. Why did it come straight out of Yellowstone Park and cut right through there? They don't know. They have hypotheses, but it's a mystery. And by the way, these things are all over the earth, except maybe Antarctica. I mean, I bet you they're there if we can get that ice off of there. But I think the environmentalists won't let us take the ice off. Here's another water gap, 350-foot high, Sweetwater River at what's called Devil's Gate. Should have went around, but instead it cut through a granite ridge. Here are some, for your Easterners, this is the Susquehanna River water gap near Harrisburg, where the river cut through 4 ridges, generally in a meander like that, when it should have went around it like this. There's water gaps. One of the best places of water gaps around here is now, the Columbia River Gorge is not a significant water gap because that's probably the lowest area, so the water would have had to go through there anyway. One of the best water gaps in this area is the Yakima River from Ellensburg to the lower Yakima Valley, where it should have went straight east into the Columbia, but suddenly takes a right-hand turn and cuts through these lava ridges that are, 2,000 feet above Ellensburg, and cuts through it. I was just there, I think either yesterday or the day before, where we are developing a creationist road guide for eastern Washington and the Columbia Gorge and western Montana, the channeled scablands, that should be out in about a year, to give our interpretation of the geology. We're doing one for Yellowstone and the Tetons this summer. We've already done Yellowstone, and one's going to come out in about a month on the John Day fossil beds in Oregon. You can get these from the Creation Research Society. Hope Answers in Genesis carries them. But this is as you're going along, you can see our interpretation of the rocks. But anyway, that's an advertisement for that. This is a wind gap. I'm not going to get into wind gaps. But anyway, this is the Zagros Mountains. They have 300 water gaps there. And the interesting thing about them that they don't hardly follow valleys. Most of the time they go across barriers. It's really a strange situation. The Zagros drainage pattern is distinctive by virtue of its disregard of major geological obstructions, both on a general scale and in detail. Certain streams ignore structure completely. Some appear to seek obstacles to transect. Some of these water gaps in the Zagros are 8,000 feet deep, deeper than Grand Canyon. And where the river could have gone easily around it, it just goes right through it. Nature doesn't do things like that. The flood can explain it. How? Well, here's how I think it is. This is the conclusion. You had water going perpendicular to a rising ridge. And as all ridges are, there's low spots and there's high spots. And where it was low, the water started to take advantage of it and accelerate through it as some parts became exposed. And it dug the water gap rapidly, like this. And then when it was all over with, for some reason, this gap didn't erode enough, and it ended up with wind just going through it. And this one, being the lowest spot, the river's going to naturally flow through that. So I think that's how it was formed easily in the flood. Now, pediments. Pediments are those flat surfaces at the bases of mountains. Here's a typical pediment at the Tobacco Root Mountains in southwest Montana. These pediments are by the thousands in the Rocky Mountains. You see them in Arizona at the foots of mountains. There's a flat surface. You don't probably notice them. I mean, until I put on my flood glasses, I'd look at the mountains. I love mountains. I didn't notice those things. But you know, they're all over. What's so distinctive about these things? Well, nature doesn't form flat surfaces. They're gravel capped, by the way. Here's one in the Ruby Mountain Valley of Montana. Here's a sedimentary rocks. They dip at a shallow like this, and the pediment cuts against it. And here's the rounded rocks on it. Those are called pediments. They're like planation surfaces at the foots of mountains. How do they form? Well, this time I think the water was going parallel to the rising mountains that were folding and cracking, and the cracks got eroded the fastest. And as the water was going down at high speeds down the valley, it was forming flat surfaces at the bases of the valley or the mountains, whatever, or ridge. And when it was all over with, you ended up with a flat surface called a pediment. That's how I think they formed rapidly during the flood. What about submarine? Oh, yeah, pediments. Here's a quote by a guy named Doran in Geomorphology of Desert Environments, 1994. He says, you see them a lot in deserts. Deserts are the best place to see them, but you have them in all climates. You have them in the Yukon Territory, a lot of places besides deserts. He says pediments have long been a subject of geomorphological scrutiny. Yeah, they know about them. They're not any big surprise. They know about them. Unfortunately, the net result of this long history of study is not altogether clear or cogent, and has not produced a clear understanding of the processes responsible for pediment development. Now, what is he saying? Now, as a weather forecaster for 30 years, I became a master of weasel words. And these are weasel words for we don't know. We haven't got the foggiest idea how they formed. I can recognize weasel words from one weasel to another. But I've since repented of my sin, and I'm doing penance by going out and talking about all this. Submarine canyons. There are canyons perpendicular to the continents that are very deep. The average submarine canyon is 3,000 feet deep, 50 miles long, but some of them are, actually a fair amount of them are deeper than Grand Canyon. One of them is 12,000 feet deep canyon. It's called, if I could pronounce it right, Zemchung Canyon on the Bering Shelf off the Bering Sea. And the Bering Canyon is longer than Grand Canyon. Here's how I think they formed. You had sheet erosion off the continent, formed the continental shelves. This isn't drawn quite right. I'm trying to get Dan Leith of Answers in Genesis to redraw it for me, but he's so busy that doing cartoons for Ken Ham that I've been trying for. I think he's going to do it here soon. But anyway, see, you should see the sediments pile up first, and then the canyon cut, and it's cut as it becomes more channelized, and instead of depositing the continental shelf, it erodes a channel in the continental shelf perpendicular to the continents, like this. Here's another. Now this should form first. And by the way, these submarine canyons are sort of like a reflection of what you have on land, a valley. Here's a valley, and then you have a deep canyon off here. Just kind of a continuation of the current off land that continued on the continental shelf during the channelized phase of the flood. And here's what you end up with. Perpendicular, these submarine canyons, kind of with a valley, very similar, like a reflection of this canyon here. Now, they're unknown too, how they form. Here's a report, one from Geology, the journal Geology, 1998. At present, there are few studies of the processes by which submarine canyons are initiated or grow. And further work is needed to document how self-indenting submarine canyons form and how they interact with subaerially incised valleys, essentially saying we don't really know the origin of submarine canyons. And some of these canyons are cut into granite. Besides the shelf sediments, they cut all the way down through it and into granite. They're really very interesting features. In summary, major features of the Earth's surface can be readily explained by the retreating stage of the flood. Massive erosion leaves behind tall erosional remnants, planation surfaces, and long transported boulders. The eroded sediments form the continental shelf. Valleys, canyons, wind and water gaps, pediments, and submarine canyons form rapidly during the channelized phase of the flood. Mainstream geologists have great difficulty explaining all these features with their slow processes over millions of years model. All these features are worldwide, indicating a global flood, not a local flood. Therefore, there is startling evidence that Noah's flood really happened. And if you want to know more about this topic of geomorphology, it forms one chapter in the new book that just came out that I published, the Missoula Flood Controversy and the Genesis Flood. The point of this book is the controversy of why they didn't see the Missoula flood in eastern Washington. This is the potholes, by the way, the remnant of a 400-foot waterfall, and these are the plunge pools out of the dry areas of eastern Washington. Dry Falls, that's another one. But, these features are all over the place out there. The evidence is just overwhelming, and yet for 40 years they rejected it. Wouldn't even go out to look at it. Why? Because it was too big, too global. Because it was 400 feet going over Spokane, Washington, 400 feet going over Portland. It sounded too biblical, and that was the reason they rejected it. But when they went out there, it was as plain as day. And as a result, it shows you their bias. They got those blinders of uniformitarianism on, and they're not going to see the Genesis flood. So the point of this is I'm pointing out the controversy, and as a result, they're not going to see the evidence of the Genesis flood. And in the process, I talk about some of the latest stuff I and others have done on the Genesis flood and the question of time. Thank you.